Good morning, boys and girls. Hope you're having a great start to your day. Happy Wednesday. We're moving along in our social studies. I've been sharing my excitement for our journal entries with the other teachers, and it's so wonderful to see your knowledge and learning of the immigration movement into your historical fiction journal entries. But Mr. Dorenzo and I have been working on a short unit on um, what's called Search for Freedom. And we're going to cover a couple of different areas, one being, as you can see today, slavery in New York, and then move along to the Civil War and the Civil War in New York and some important and influential people through that time period. And then we'll end with the women's suffrage movement. So I want to talk a little bit about today what slavery looked like in New York, because I think we have a picture of or an idea that slavery was something that was separate from New York and that it perhaps was only on farms and plantations in the South, and that's not necessarily true. So I think it's important for us to think about what we see as New York today. You know, New York is known for its diversity and its developing values, right? We're sort of known as the city of immigrants. And so how do we live up to that? How has our history changed since then? Because New York really does hold a pretty dark past in its participation of slavery, slave markets, enslaved people, and the buying and selling and keeping of slaves. And this goes all the way back to the Dutch West India Company. When we think back to our studies early in the fall, when we learned about the Dutch West India Company, you know, enticing families to come here and develop the southern tip of New York, which is right here. As you can see, it was still forested. And you know, it was from the 1600s to really 1827. So 2 centuries of New York sort of having this culture and belief and use of slavery. And that, you know, enslaved African Americans really were the framework for our state and during those years. So, you know, again, we think about slavery, we think of the South. But today's lesson is really going to focus on what was an enslaved person's life like in New York, and how did New York play a role in that? And one of the things that's interesting is that while the South was predominantly or very public in their support of slavery, New York was one of the largest, well, had the largest population of enslaved people in the northern states at the time. So here's a picture, actually, I found some really interesting pictures. This is Fort Amsterdam. If you remember, Fort Amsterdam became New Netherlands, which eventually became the New York colony when the English took over. And the C here says C 1665. So that's circa 1665, which means about 1665. And this fort that you can see happening in that picture, if you look closely, was built by enslaved Africans. You know, they were responsible for the building of the infrastructure of what is today New York. You know, yes, there were farms, even as north as Westchester, under the Dutch rule, that had farming run by enslaved people for sugar and cotton. But aside from farming, you know, it was the enslaved people that were really the labor force for New York City. You know, the businessmen, the merchants, they could not do it all. And so they relied on their purchasing and ownership of slaves to do that work. So work like blacksmithing, carpentry, building, buildings, homes, streets, Even the ports where boats would come in were all responsible or done by slaves. But interestingly enough, the slaves were not just hard labor, skilled or unskilled, but also they were called upon to defend fur traders, and to defend them in skirmishes with the Native Americans. Because you have to remember, when we were learning about the Dutch West India Company coming in, you know, while the enslaved people were coming from Africa, we still had the Native Americans fighting for their land as well. So the jobs and the responsibilities that the Dutch put on the slaves increased even further once England took over the colony and it became New York. And what they often had is what they called slave markets. Let me show you a picture of that. So actually, here's one other picture. One of the earliest depictions of New Amsterdam. So it's hard to see in this picture, but we have the port. This is New York City. And they had slave markets, just like a market you would buy produce or other goods. It's where they would, the enslaved people would come off the ships, and landowners would be there ready to purchase or sell if you were here. And you would then become really property owner. The people would own these individuals to do their work. And here's just an example of just a sort of the bustling of conversation and decision making that's happening. So I wanted to show you this picture. Some of the research that I was doing for today's lesson brought me to even some specific people named in Westchester. So this is Caleb Heathcote, and if you know anything from Scarsdale, Heathcote is an area of Scarsdale, and he's the founder of the Manor of Scarsdale, in fact. And he was the mayor during what we're going to learn about in just a minute is the uprisings of slaves in 1712. Okay. And one of the things you have to remember, well, first I'll show you this too quickly. So here we have just the different parts. There were manors, okay? So starting with one, this is Van Cortlandt, 1697, Phillipsburg, Scarsdale, Pelham, Fordham, and Morrisania, okay? But one of the things that Caleb Heathcote really worked towards, you know, was understanding the angst and the drive for slaves to become free and to defend their rights as humans. And so the riots, 1712, were slave rebellions where they were trying to show their disapproval and their, you know, what anyone would do in a situation where they feel that their rights and their voices are not being heard. And one of the things also that would often happen was that, you know, people would run away. Slaves would find their way, find refuge, trying to get free. Some of them would travel to Canada. And what this article here is showing is actually in a newspaper talking about a young boy who's gotten away. On the 30th of January, 1778, a Negro boy named Alec, about 15 years of age, had on when he went away a check shirt, reddish color jacket, breeches, stockings, and a hat. He's branded on the breast with the letters RW, so he had the letters of his owner on him. Whoever will secure said boy or give information of any person or persons harboring him shall receive $4 reward. And it goes on to talk about what would, you know, if they find this young boy. So a lot of them were captured and brought back, and people would do that for the money as well. So here's another gentleman I wanted to share with you, and this is Governor Daniel D. Tompkins, also originally from Scarsdale, which is interesting. And he's actually most known for his participation in gradually getting slaves free in New York. And this process was not short. As you can see, it started in 1817, actually even earlier than that. And it wasn't until 1827 that what they call the manumission of slaves occurred. Manumission means the freeing of slaves. And it wasn't an easy task. He had to speak with the New York legislature and convince and build a case as to why it was time and the just and right to do that, which is to free these slaves. And it slowly happened. At first it was children of slaves were free. And then eventually more and more rights were given to the slaves until the end when they were officially or legally freed within the state. Again, starting even well before 1817, and even when it ended in slavery in 1827, as we know with anything, things take time. So while it was on paper, it took some time for that to actually come into fruition. And so this is Governor Tompkins. And here's a house, an old existing farmhouse in Scarsdale that I thought was quite interesting. And he also, being a slave owner at the time, but in his will requested that they be freed, which often happened in wills of the deceased where they wanted to free their slaves. And this is down in the city, which is in honor a monument in Lower Manhattan to honor and recognize the enslaved African Americans, Africans who really were the foundation of what our city is today, in our state. And if it weren't for their hands and their time and their hard work, we owe it to them as far as what they have contributed to the culture and the prosperity of our state. And so I'm going to go back for a minute. And so, in the end, New York profited from allowing enslaved people to work in our state. And it was, something that was part of the culture. And over time, realizing that that wasn't obviously a way of life for them or a way of treating others and equality, which will bring us into all the other things when we get into the Civil War. So that is a bit of history. There's so much we can go on. I can spend all day talking to you about it, but I just hope that this lesson will give you an opportunity to get a sense of what life was like for an enslaved person in New York State, the contributions they made to New York State, the way in which our influential people and landowners relied on slaves in those early days. And so what I'm going to give you today is your teacher is going to have on a separate document a link for you to preview. It's a gallery walk, and you can you're going to be asked to write down 5 more facts about, because there's so much I did not cover. So at least 5 more interesting facts that we could add to this conversation at a different day. Have a great day, everybody. I hope that you are able to find some more interesting facts about our topic today. And we will continue this conversation with Mr. Dorenzo tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody.